A single figure disrupted the polished calm of a high-end bank, a man whose presence was met not with welcome, but with an invisible current of resistance. Dark-skinned and poised, he carried with him a quiet storm, an unspoken challenge to the walls built by years of quiet exclusion. Every calculated slight, every cold dismissal, was a thread unraveling a fabric of power long thought unbreakable. Behind his steady gaze hid a secret that would topple the very institution trying to erase him. This is a story of silent battles, hidden truths, and a reckoning that no one expected. If you're ready to dive deep into this journey of courage and consequence, hit like, subscribe, and share where you're watching from in the comments below. Your voice matters in this story. The morning sunlight filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Varelli First National Bank, catching the glass with such sharp precision it felt like walking into a showroom. The atmosphere was hushed, almost reverent, as if noise itself would offend the wealth nestled inside these walls. Every marble tile gleamed, every brushed bronze fixture whispered luxury. This wasn't a place for the casual or the curious. It was curated for exclusivity. Theron Colby stepped in like he belonged, which, in every way that should have mattered, he did. He wore a dark gray suit tailored to complement his lean frame, a narrow Windsor not centered on a crisp white shirt, and a black leather briefcase that bore not a single scuff. His movements were deliberate, poised, not flashy, but sharp. He made it 5 steps past the automated doors before the security desk buzzed into life. A soft green light blinked approval on the metal archway. The motion sensor acknowledged him. There was no sound, no alert, nothing. But still, the guard stood. The man couldn't have been older than 24, with a stocky build and a jaw that locked too easily, his expression unreadable behind the thin sheen of professional detachment. He raised his hand, palm out, as if Theron had missed some invisible boundary. Theron stopped. He tilted his head slightly, the only signal that he didn't understand. The guard looked down at his monitor, tapped twice, then lifted his gaze with rehearsed authority. "Sir, I'll need to do a manual verification." The system shows a blurred scan, probably just a sensor misfire. His voice was even, but something about the way he said it felt off. The 2 clients who had entered just seconds before, a man in cargo shorts and an older woman in a puffy coat, were already being welcomed past the reception desk. No one had stopped them. Theron glanced at the archway again. Still green, still silent. "Manual verification?" he asked, his voice low and calm. The guard didn't answer. He gestured toward the inspection bench near the side wall. "Please remove your belt and shoes." For a moment, Theron didn't move. He shouldn't have had to think about it, shouldn't have had to weigh dignity against convenience. But here he was again, another place where his presence felt less like arrival and more like intrusion. He inhaled quietly through his nose, set down his briefcase, and stepped toward the bench. He slipped off his shoes first, placing them side by side with care. Then, with slow precision, he unfastened his belt, sliding it through the loops and folding it in half before setting it beside his shoes. His movements were soundless, practiced. The handheld scanner in the guard's hand chirped to life as he approached. Theron stood still as it passed over his back, down his arms, around his legs. The device made no sound, no vibrations, nothing. The guard clicked it off. "You're clear," he said, tone unchanged. Theron nodded once, the only acknowledgement he gave, and reassembled himself, belt through loops, shoes back on, no sign of fluster in his hands. But the sting was there, a familiar burn buried under layers of self-discipline. He picked up his briefcase and continued forward. At the reception desk, a woman with frosted glasses and a blazer too bright for her age gave him a smile that was too quick to fade. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked, fingers already typing on her tablet. Theron offered her a neatly folded paper from his inner pocket. The page bore the Varelli letterhead, the printed signature of a senior advisor, and an appointment time confirmed 2 weeks prior. The receptionist barely glanced at it. "We're limiting walk-ins today," she said. "You'll need to wait in the client lounge." She pointed without looking. Theron nodded again, saying nothing. The client lounge was beautifully designed to be unwelcoming. Low-back chairs and charcoal leather formed a grid along the floor, spaced far enough apart to discourage interaction, but close enough to observe every detail of those around you. There was no coffee, no water station, only an untouched bowl of ancient magazines on a square steel table, and a speaker above playing a piano loop too sterile to be real. Theron took a seat near the window, choosing a chair that gave him sight of the entire lobby. He rested his briefcase beside him, crossed his legs at the ankle, and leaned back, eyes scanning the space with quiet calculation. The minutes stretched, each one a reminder. He watched as 3 white clients walked in, greeted with warmth and ushered toward inner offices. No one asked them to remove anything. No one checked their credentials twice. At one point, a banker emerged, holding a tray with 2 glasses of water and a smile reserved for someone else. He passed directly in front of Theron without a flicker of acknowledgement. He glanced at the frosted glass door to the private offices. Behind it, decisions were being made, transactions approved, hands shaken. Worlds moved forward while he stayed stuck in stillness. He leaned slightly forward, adjusting his briefcase so it rested parallel with his feet, the metal latch glinting under the soft lighting. As he did, a staff member emerged from a side hallway pushing a cleaning cart, rubber wheels rolling noiselessly across the polished stone. The man wore a navy smock, a plastic apron, and blue nitrile gloves. There was no name tag. His eyes didn't meet Theron's, but his movements were oddly focused. Instead of continuing past the lounge, he veered toward Theron's corner, pausing directly in front of him. With the speed of someone executing a pre-assigned task, he dropped a gray plastic waste tray, empty and stained with previous use, down at Theron's feet without a word. It landed hard against the marble with a hollow thud. A moment later, the man produced a spray bottle from the cart and began misting the floor around the lounge chairs. Not the entire area, just the narrow space between Theron's seat and the wall. The chemical scent was sharp, bitter with alcohol and synthetic citrus. The mist floated through the air in small clouds before settling down, some of it landing on Theron's slacks, darkening the fabric along the ankle and calf. A fine sheen splashed across his shoes, leaving splotches on the leather. Theron didn't react at first. He merely shifted his foot back, slow and measured, then looked up. The cleaner still hadn't acknowledged him. The man stepped forward and sprayed again, closer this time, the nozzle angling downward, but too close for it to be accidental. A cluster of tiny droplets caught the edge of Theron's cuff. A few more moments passed before the man finally muttered a single phrase that wasn't meant to be heard, but wasn't low enough to be private. "Can't have things too dirty near the glass." Then he moved on, pushing the cart further down the hallway without a glance backward. Theron exhaled quietly through his nose, not sharply, but with the forced restraint of someone stacking insult on top of insult and still refusing to shatter. He pulled a handkerchief from his inside pocket and dabbed at the fabric. The disinfectant left a chemical shine over the leather of his shoe. He didn't wipe it completely off. He left the residue, as if to let it stay visible, to document the moment. The receptionist never looked up. The security guard, still watching, said nothing. A couple who had just entered the lobby walked past the lounge on their way to a private desk. The man looked over at Theron with a vague frown, as if unsure whether he was a client or an intruder. The woman beside him clutched her purse tighter. Theron saw all of it. He saw how a single act, unspoken, impersonal, but precise, could shift the atmosphere of a space. That trash tray at his feet wasn't for convenience. It was a marker. It suggested contamination. It was a cue, unspoken but loud. This man does not belong. This area must be cleaned after him. A digital display near the ceiling showed the time. He'd been waiting an hour and 13 minutes. No one had offered water. No one had asked his name. The client who had walked in 20 minutes after him was already leaving. He passed the lounge holding a document folder with a satisfied smile, shaking hands with an advisor in a tailored gray vest. As the man left, he threw a brief glance at Theron, then quickly away. Theron leaned back slightly, straightening the crease of his trousers with one smooth pull at the knee. The disinfectant was starting to dry, leaving faint white marks like water damage. He didn't brush them off. He let them sit. Across the room, a junior banker walked through with a tablet in hand, eyes scanning the space. She paused mid-step when she saw Theron. Her expression flickered for half a second, confusion, discomfort, maybe even recognition, but then she pivoted away, heading to a different corner of the building. Theron noticed the pause. He noticed everything. A second employee from maintenance passed by, empty-handed this time, and casually kicked the waste tray closer to Theron's feet without stopping. The tray tilted sideways, touching the toe of his shoe. No one acknowledged the action. It was silent, almost elegant in its pettiness. Theron's chest tightened, but he said nothing. He hadn't said a word since being asked to remove his shoes. This was the unwritten rule of endurance in rooms like this. Every small humiliation is a test, and the moment you push back, you confirm their justification. Patience was no longer virtue. It had become punishment. At 1 hour and 29 minutes, he made a decision, not out of frustration, not even anger, but out of the quiet logic that came when dignity refused to be buried under silence. He reached down, set his briefcase upright, adjusted the lapel of his blazer, and stood. The tray at his feet rocked back and forth and then tipped flat with a light clatter. He left it where it was. His shoes clicked against the marble floor as he crossed back toward the reception desk. He didn't walk fast, but each step was deliberate, the rhythm clean and measured, like someone refusing to sneak through a space that had already denied him entry. The receptionist, still behind her high-gloss counter, pretended not to notice him until he was just a few steps away. She tapped something on her screen, glanced up, and smiled a practiced smile too sharp at the corners. Before Theron could speak, movement blurred at the edges of his vision. From the left hallway came a man in a tailored maroon vest, carrying a clipboard and walking with the swagger of someone who believed this floor belonged to him. From the right, a younger woman in heels, holding a folder, her stride quick and eager. Neither of them made eye contact. Theron had just opened his mouth, about to speak to the receptionist, when the two employees collided with him in perfect synchrony. Shoulder to shoulder, body to body, the kind of coordinated accident that was too smooth to be unplanned. The clipboard struck his chest on the left, the folder cracked into his wrist on the right, and the impact forced him slightly backward. His briefcase slipped from his hand. It hit the floor hard. The lock snapped open. The contents, documents, forms, sealed envelopes, fanned across the pristine marble in a ripple of crisp paper and dislodged order. For a second, there was only the sound of paper sliding and the faint gasp of a junior banker walking nearby. Theron looked down, instinct pushing him to kneel, but restraint held him upright. He didn't bend. The two employees who had collided with him stood there, both now looking at him with feigned surprise, wide eyes full of mock innocence. The man in the vest tilted his head slightly, his lips twitching as if amused by how well their timing had landed. The woman beside him didn't say a word. She took a small step back, pretending to reorient herself, then walked around him as though he were a decorative column in her way. No apology, no pause, just forward motion. The receptionist looked down at the scattered documents, then up at Theron, then back to her screen. She said nothing. No one moved to help. A security camera in the ceiling blinked red. The guard at the far end of the lobby shifted his stance and crossed his arms. Theron remained still for a few seconds longer, then finally knelt. He didn't rush. He collected the pages one by one, finger steady, straightening edges that had bent in the fall, returning them to the briefcase as if each sheet still deserved to be held with precision. The envelope marked confidential now had a smear across its corner from someone's heel. He tucked it underneath the rest. He closed the case slowly, stood, brushed off the front of his blazer with the back of his hand, and looked once more at the receptionist. She blinked as if surprised he was still standing there, then glanced over his shoulder, scanning for someone else more worth her time. Theron didn't speak. He gave a slight nod, more a courtesy than anything earned, and walked away. Not back to the waiting area, but further down the hall toward the service offices. He passed several framed mission statements along the wall, each one full of buzzwords like inclusion and integrity and service excellence. They glinted under the lights like a cruel joke. A senior banker passed him on the way, flipping through an iPad, and didn't look up. Theron continued until he reached a frosted door marked Client Experience Office, then paused in front of it. He didn't knock. He didn't enter. He just stood, breath steady, gaze fixed forward, his mind calculating the shape of a space that had already decided what role he was allowed to play. Behind the door, a muffled conversation rose, then faded. No one opened it. No one acknowledged him. He stood alone in the hallway, a briefcase clutched tighter than before, the scrape on the folder corner like a quiet scar that wouldn't vanish. The employees who had struck him were now gone, their absence more deafening than their actions. And yet, in that sterile silence, something deeper than anger began to grow. Not heat, but gravity. The understanding that this building wasn't just designed to exclude him, it was engineered to humiliate him in increments so small, so polished, that the violence looked like process. He turned away from the door and walked back toward the main lobby, his pace no longer slow, but not rushed. Clients came and went, most dressed far less formally than him, yet none received the scrutiny, the indifference, or the treatment that trailed his every step. The briefcase now rested upright with the latch double-checked, but he no longer watched the clock. Time had lost its usual form, replaced instead by a grim awareness of space, how it responded to him, how it warped around his presence without ever acknowledging it directly. He was no longer waiting for service. He was observing, memorizing, letting each interaction etch itself into memory for reasons even he hadn't fully formed. The soft thump of heels echoed across the polished floor, approaching from behind his right shoulder. He didn't look up immediately. He could hear the rhythm, confident, sharp, and unapologetic. When the scent hit his nostrils, he knew she was close. It wasn't perfume so much as weaponized presence, overpowering jasmine laced with sharp musk, the kind of scent that demanded to be noticed. The woman passed in front of him slowly, almost too slowly for someone simply walking from one room to another. She wore a pale pink blouse tucked into a high-waisted skirt, and her makeup was meticulous, the kind worn not for beauty, but for battlefield dominance. She carried a bottle of perfume in one hand, her manicured fingers wrapped tightly around the gold neck, index extended along the glass in a poised, almost theatrical gesture. As she reached the edge of his peripheral vision, she paused. It was only for half a second, but in that moment, she tilted the bottle slightly, releasing two short bursts into the air directly above Theron's head. The mist descended like a veil, coating the air in heavy fragrance. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't accidental. Theron inhaled, the scent catching in the back of his throat. He blinked once, but didn't flinch. The woman resumed walking. Then, as if remembering something, pivoted back a single step. She reached into the pocket of her skirt and pulled out a tube of lipstick, deep crimson, matte, unmistakably bold. With one fluid motion, she twisted the base, exposing the pigment, and then, without a word, leaned slightly toward Theron's seated form. Her hand extended, and before he could process the movement, she pressed the side of the lipstick gently but firmly into his lapel. The red smear bled across the fabric like a mark of ownership or accusation. It was done with the precision of someone who had practiced the gesture before, and when she stepped back, she looked down at the stain, then up into his eyes. Her expression was calm but deliberate, her smirk not wide enough to be public, but sharp enough to deliver the message clearly. She turned and walked away without a sound, her heels clicking once more in staccato rhythm against the floor. Theron looked down at his lapel. The smear stood out against the charcoal weave of the suit, a garish red stroke on gray. He didn't reach for it. He didn't rub it away. Touching it would only set it deeper. From across the lobby, a man in a pinstripe suit glanced in his direction, saw the mark, and quickly looked away. Another employee, carrying a tray of bottled waters for a nearby meeting room, veered to avoid walking past Theron entirely, choosing a longer path around the reception desk. The message had landed, loudly, visibly. The mark on his lapel didn't just stain his clothing, it reframed his presence. The immaculate black man in a tailored suit was now marked by lipstick, by silence, by implication. He could see how the stain changed perception, how eyes looked longer, judged faster, avoided quicker. The receptionist, who had ignored him before, now gave him brief, clipped glances, her mouth pressed into a thin line of unease. Theron sat, perfectly still. Internally, he was calculating, measuring what this moment meant, how it connected with the others, and how it would be remembered. Everything was happening in layers. First a foresearch, then the cleaner's mist, then the engineered collision. And now this, the cosmetic branding of shame disguised as accident. These weren't individual acts. They were a sequence, a structure, and he was trapped within it. The lipstick had been chosen carefully, red, bold, unmistakable. Not something easily explained away, not something easily cleaned. It made him look compromised, as if he'd been somewhere he shouldn't, done something he hadn't. Theron knew what assumptions it would trigger. He knew what questions it was meant to raise in the minds of everyone watching. And the worst part? It had been done with a smile. He reached into his briefcase slowly, pulling out a small black cloth he carried for wiping down his phone and lenses. He pressed the edge of it gently against the lapel, but did not scrub. The fabric of the suit was fine wool, and any rubbing would grind the color deeper. It was better to let it sit, for now. He folded the cloth, returned it to the side compartment, and rested his hand atop the case. Across the room, the woman had vanished into one of the upper offices. No witnesses would confirm what she had done. There were no apologies, no explanations, and certainly no corrections. The smirk on her face, as she turned away, said everything. In this space, she could do what she pleased, and there would be no consequence. He hadn't been offered so much as a napkin, and no one dared speak to him about it, either to apologize or explain. Instead, the staff moved around him like he was a fixed obstruction, a disruption they had to pretend didn't exist. The waiting continued. Clients arrived, names were called, transactions processed, signatures requested, pleasantries exchanged. He observed the clock. Nearly 2 hours had passed since his scheduled appointment, yet his name had not been uttered once. Finally, at 2 hours and 3 minutes, a name echoed through the air, not his, but then came a pause, a shift in tone, and then a second name, Mr. Colby. The voice came from a teller near the far end of the row, a young man in a dark blue tie whose face betrayed none of the tension that filled the room. Theron rose slowly, straightened his blazer, collected his briefcase, and walked toward the teller counter, each step heavy with the invisible weight of what had been done to him and what he would not forget. As he approached, the teller glanced briefly at the red mark on his lapel, then quickly looked away, forcing his attention back to the screen in front of him. "Just a moment, sir," the teller said, tapping the keyboard. The screen blinked once, then froze. He tapped again, then harder. His expression remained controlled, but the subtle twitch at the corner of his mouth betrayed frustration. "Strange," he murmured, more to himself than to Theron. "The system just went offline. It was fine a moment ago." Theron waited in silence, eyes narrowing just slightly, watching the flickering monitor. The teller reached for his phone and tapped a number. "Yeah, it's station 4. It just locked me out. No, nothing's changed. It was working 5 minutes ago." He paused. "Okay." He hung up and turned toward Theron with a tone of forced politeness. "I'm very sorry, Mr. Colby, but it seems we're having a temporary issue with our network. I'll need to request a technician to take a look at it. Unfortunately, the on-site tech is at another branch right now. We'll need to wait for them to come over." Theron didn't speak, but his stare didn't waver. "It shouldn't be long," the teller added quickly, though the words rang hollow. "Maybe 20 minutes?" Theron glanced at the screen, then at the other teller stations beside them. All of them were working. Clients were being served. Transactions processed. Receipts printed. He turned his head slightly and looked toward the far corner, where a woman had just finished signing her loan paperwork and received a congratulatory handshake. There had been no outages there, no technician summoned, no apologies required. The issue was not with the network. It was with the man standing in front of it. The teller shifted uncomfortably. "If you'd like, you can return to the lounge while we sort this out," he offered, gesturing to the side. Theron looked at the lounge, the same lounge where he had been targeted, marked, and ignored for over 2 hours. He offered no words, no protest, just a slight nod of acknowledgement, and turned back toward the seating area. As he walked, he heard a soft mechanical whir behind him, the sound of curtains being drawn. He turned subtly, just enough to see the heavy cream-colored partition slowly slide across a metal rail, separating the teller area from the lounge. The space was being sectioned off, redivided, and suddenly, he was on the wrong side of it again. The visual impact was immediate, a clear message to the rest of the bank that the man who had approached the counter was no longer a client. They had closed him off, boxed him into a corner where he could no longer be seen, no longer be associated with the regular flow of service. It wasn't just isolation, it was rejection in architecture. Theron resumed his seat, this time at the far end of the lounge, eyes trained not on the curtain or the teller, but on the camera in the far corner of the ceiling. It was angled slightly, perhaps enough to catch the full sweep of the room and the deliberate way it had excluded him. The sound of soft conversation returned. Laughter echoed faintly from a nearby office. Someone accepted a delivery of pastries. Time resumed its smooth glide for everyone else in the room, everyone except him. The scent of the lipstick was still in the fibers of his suit. The residue from the disinfectant still dulled the shine on his shoes. And now, a physical barrier separated him from resolution. The illusion of neutrality had shattered. The curtain wasn't just fabric. It was a wall built from decisions. Decisions to delay, to lie, to isolate. It moved slowly, but with purpose, like someone was controlling it behind the scenes. Theron studied the texture of the fabric. It wasn't new. It had been used before. This wasn't an improvised solution. This was protocol, unspoken, undocumented, but real. From a far side of the lobby, near the administrative desk behind the decorative indoor plants, a low-speaker tone chimed to life. It was not music. It was not the usual soft jazz or ambient piano the bank used to relax its preferred clientele. No, this was a flat, sterile voice, clearly a recording, projecting through a hidden speaker system meant for internal training. Now deliberately turned up just enough to float across the room and breach the curtain separation. The voice was male, emotionless, the cadence familiar to anyone who had ever sat through a corporate compliance meeting. Effective this quarter, it said, we remind all employees to exercise increased vigilance with client interactions, especially regarding walk-ins and unverified individuals. Due to a spike in suspicious account activity, certain profiles may require enhanced scrutiny. All staff are encouraged to maintain professional distance and report any behavior that appears inconsistent with standard client expectations. The speaker paused, letting the words hang. The volume was not deafening, but it was carefully calibrated, loud enough to cross the space, loud enough for Theron to hear every syllable, and loud enough to ensure that every employee walking past him, every junior banker carrying a clipboard or resetting the coffee machine, would hear it too. Theron blinked slowly. The timing was precise. The language chosen with surgical ambiguity. No names, no races, no specific accusations. Just enough implication to link every word to the man behind the curtain who hadn't caused a scene, hadn't raised his voice, and hadn't made a single misstep, except to exist in that room with a name they refused to call and a body they refused to serve. The voice resumed, listing preventative measures. If clients appear nervous, lack clarity about their accounts, or display hesitation when asked for verification, escalate the situation to a supervisor. These signs may indicate fraudulent intent. Always trust your instincts. Prevention begins with awareness. Theron's jaw remained still, but inside, something twisted. The language wasn't designed to educate. It was designed to inoculate guilt. A script of justification. A verbal alibi for prejudice. Around him, no one reacted visibly, but he saw the effects. A junior teller passed the lounge and slowed just slightly, her eyes flickering to the red smear still visible on his lapel, then to the briefcase at his feet. A second employee, holding a stack of files, gave him a wide berth, circling behind the lounge chairs as if avoiding contamination. No one stopped. No one challenged the recording. It continued unbroken. We are also implementing a trial surveillance sync, the voice said, linking customer profile flags with on-premise behavior. Clients who trigger 3 or more irregularity points during their visit may require additional reporting. Remember, compliance is protection. Theron lowered his gaze for a moment, his fingers interlacing calmly, but the grip tightened just enough to press tension into his knuckles. He wasn't just being ignored anymore, he was being painted. Crafted into a cautionary tale while sitting in silence, dressed in a suit still damp from disinfectant, still marked by crimson, still denied service under the lie of technical delay. The staff moved as if the recording were part of the daily soundtrack, a casual announcement that carried no real weight. But that was the genius of it. It didn't have to sound accusatory to work. It only had to linger in the subconscious, reinforcing the story already being visually told by his isolation, by the curtain, by the lack of eye contact, by the absence of accountability. The voice continued into policy jargon, citing sections, procedural mandates, and statistics. None of it personal, all of it plausible. That was the cruelest layer. It sounded reasonable. It sounded professional. And yet, its real purpose was to ensure that when anyone looked at Theron Colby sitting quietly behind the curtain, they wouldn't see a man waiting with an appointment and credentials. They would see a risk, a profile, a caution flag. The recording ended with a chime, then silence. Not even music returned. Just the quiet murmur of controlled transactions, the rustle of files, the occasional whisper between staff who wouldn't meet his gaze. Theron lifted his eyes and focused again on the security camera. It hadn't moved. It didn't blink. But he had begun to suspect it wasn't there to protect him. It had shifted the narrative further, spoken loudly enough to frame him as something less than legitimate, while remaining just vague enough to evade accountability. He watched the staff on the other side of the partition move with ease, laughter returning, relaxed tones flowing through the air. In contrast, he remained still and silent, his presence marked as foreign to that ease, as though his very existence disrupted the carefully curated environment. Then the energy shifted again. He heard the distinct clack of high heels, slow, purposeful, echoing with confidence. The kind of gait that belonged to someone used to control. A presence that made junior staff straighten their backs without thinking. Through the break in the curtain, a woman emerged. She wore a fitted gray pantsuit, heels lacquered to a mirror finish, and carried a thin tablet pressed tightly to her side. Her hair was wound into a precise twist at the base of her neck, and her smile was the sort reserved for power dynamics, never warm, always sharp. She stopped short upon seeing Theron still seated. Her brows lifted. The staff who'd been near the counters didn't move, but the subtle shift in their postures said they were watching. The senior manager's eyes narrowed, not in confusion, but irritation. Her voice cut through the air, loud enough to carry, but still flavored with faux civility. "Excuse me, sir," she said with exaggerated politeness. "You've been in this area for quite a while now. Are you lost?" Theron didn't answer. He didn't move. His fingers remained folded over the handle of his briefcase. Her smile widened, a theatrical curve that didn't reach her eyes. "We've had some reports of a guest occupying space without a clear appointment." She tilted her head. "This area is for approved clientele, not loitering." That word struck like a hammer. Loitering. As if his presence, his suit, his briefcase, the appointment confirmation tucked inside, all of it meant nothing against the narrative she had decided to enforce. He opened his mouth slightly, about to respond, when she raised a hand as though she'd anticipated protest. "No need to explain," she said brightly. "If you need directions back to your local branch, we'd be happy to assist." Behind her, a teller laughed. Not loudly, but just enough to answer her sarcasm with recognition. The manager glanced over her shoulder and smiled at the sound, as though she'd delivered a successful punchline. Theron's throat tightened, the sting of that last phrase sharper than any of the others. Local branch. The implication wasn't about geography. It was about class, about place, about who was deemed worthy of this particular institution and who should be herded elsewhere. She stepped forward slightly and glanced at the security guard near the entrance. "Could you please assist our guest in finding his way out?" she said with performative kindness, as though she were doing him a favor. The guard, previously still, began walking slowly toward Theron, hands resting near his belt, posture straightened with the anticipation of confrontation. Theron stood before he arrived. His movements were calm, not hurried, not stiff. He lifted the briefcase from beside his chair and clicked it open, not toward the guard, not to reach for anything that could be misunderstood, but just enough to retrieve one item. From the inner sleeve, he pulled out a sleek black leather folder and held it gently at his side, keeping his posture poised and deliberate. The manager paused mid-step, perhaps expecting compliance or verbal resistance. Instead, Theron simply looked at her, his gaze even, steady, not defiant, but unshakable. He didn't say a word. The stillness in that moment became deafening. The guard slowed, sensing something shift. The manager's expression faltered. It wasn't fear. It was the beginning of uncertainty. She looked at the folder in his hand, then at the way he held it, the weight of something about to be revealed pressing against the controlled script she'd been following. But Theron didn't open it. Not yet. He let the moment stretch, let the tension breathe. He wanted her to feel the void between what she assumed and what might soon collapse her assumptions. Her smirk had vanished, replaced with something calculating. Around them, staff continued their movements, but slower now, the air thickening with an awareness that something no longer aligned. Theron stepped forward, only once, closing the distance between himself and the manager by a deliberate measure. His voice, when it finally emerged, was quiet but precise. "Are you certain you want to continue this course of action?" The question wasn't a threat. It was a test. Her mouth parted slightly, eyes narrowing again. "Excuse me," she said, not out of confusion, but as a defensive reflex. Theron said nothing more. He didn't need to. The presence of the folder, his controlled composure, and the quiet authority in his question were now creating a crack in the seamless arrogance she wore like a badge. The teller who had laughed earlier looked away. The guard, no longer approaching, stood halfway between the reception area and the lounge, glancing between Theron and the manager, clearly unsure whether he was supposed to escort or retreat. The curtain still hung like a theatrical barrier, but the energy inside the bank had shifted subtly, invisibly, like the moment before a storm's first strike. The staff, previously indifferent, now began stealing glances, sensing an undefined tension. No alarm sounded. No announcements were made. But something had begun. Theron didn't move for several minutes. The folder sat undisturbed, a silent challenge. And then, slowly, he reached into the inner pocket of his blazer. His hand emerged with a small, dark bronze pin, matte, smooth, barely larger than a thumbprint. It was shaped like a flattened shield, with a six-pointed star etched faintly into its center, encircled by a ring of raised symbols. At first glance, it looked almost like a commemorative trinket, subtle and unassuming. But anyone who knew what it meant wouldn't mistake it for decoration. He held the pin between his thumb and forefinger for only a moment before placing it down, with deliberate care, on the glass table in front of him. The pin made no sound as it touched the surface, but the air around it seemed to tighten. From her post, the manager furrowed her brow, squinting toward the object, but still too far away to make out its significance. It wasn't meant for her. It was meant for the eyes already watching. Cameras placed throughout the bank's interior were always active, a standard precaution for high-profile institutions like Varelli First National. What most employees didn't know, what Theron knew intimately, was that these cameras were integrated into a national ethics monitoring framework used in only the most sensitive financial oversight scenarios. The insignia on the pin had been encrypted with a signal signature that, once visually confirmed by a compatible surveillance system, would initiate a Red 12 alert protocol, a rare classification, one that could only be triggered by a Level 6 inspector embedded by the Federal Bureau of Ethical Oversight. The bank had just been activated for a silent audit. No one in the building was alerted, not yet. But behind the mirrored glass of the upstairs conference rooms, computers began to freeze. Keyboards stopped accepting input. Teller interfaces displayed blinking override icons. Phones linked to internal admin circuits switched to red indicators. Printers paused in mid-job. Systems locked themselves into compliance mode. preventing deletion, manual override, or further internal access to transaction logs. From the moment the insignia registered, the facility had ceased to be autonomous. Theron kept his gaze fixed on the curtain in front of him, not because he expected a confrontation, but because he knew silence would speak more violently than any words. The pin remained motionless on the table. A receptionist's headset crackled softly before going dead. A junior banker near the coffee station tapped her tablet screen 3 times before realizing the device had disconnected from its server. In the hallway leading to executive offices, lights dimmed briefly and then reset to a standard white hue, an innocuous detail, but one that signaled the building was no longer under local control. The manager stepped forward, now visibly tense, her voice no longer mocking. "What is that?" she asked, loud enough to mask her discomfort. Theron didn't answer. His hands rested on his knees, fingers lightly curled, posture calm, composed, and utterly unmoved by her sudden change in tone. "Sir," she said again more cautiously, "I'm going to need you to explain what this is." He didn't even glance at her. The pin explained itself. Behind the glass panel walls of the operations suite, a supervisor opened a drawer for a form and found that the lock had engaged automatically, barring access. Another employee tried logging into the secure payroll system, only to be redirected to a federal server request screen. The red 12 alert didn't require human input. It didn't knock. It entered and took command. Downstairs, the security office monitors began flashing status requests from a remote authority node, and one of the guards picked up his radio with growing unease. "We've got system feedback. Doesn't match any test schedule," he mumbled. "Do we have someone from DC on site?" His partner shrugged. They hadn't received a memo, but the system had. Theron finally stood. He reached forward, picked up the pin from the table, and returned it calmly to the inner pocket of his jacket. Its purpose had been fulfilled. There was no need to flaunt it. The cameras had seen. The network had listened. Secure all surveillance footage and submit detailed reports to headquarters within the day. There were no explanations, no pleasantries, no room for discussion, just cold, bureaucratic commands printed on perfectly aligned sheets, distributed in lockstep to every managerial desk, break room, and security post. The mechanical rhythm of the printers acted like a heartbeat throughout the building, pounding in sync with the rising tension. In the manager's office, the woman who had so confidently mocked Theron earlier now stood rigid, staring down at the paper with eyes wide, hands trembling slightly as she took it from the tray. Her voice, once sharp and assured, had been replaced by a tight-lipped silence. Her assistant entered the room, and without exchanging words, they both turned toward the bank's internal security feed displayed on a wall-mounted monitor. The camera angles shifted rapidly, focusing on the very areas Theron had occupied: the lobby, the VIP lounge, the teller stations, even the hallways where subtle acts of exclusion had unfolded. The footage was no longer just stored. It was being analyzed in real time by an unseen algorithm. Faces of employees caught in awkward moments, furtive glances, whispered conversations, subtle gestures, were being flagged and timestamped. The head of security sat in his cramped office, the glow from 3 monitors illuminating a face now marked by worry and resignation. He toggled between live camera feeds and the printed directives now stacked on his desk, the gravity of the order sinking in. This was no ordinary procedure. This was an emergency intervention initiated by the highest federal authority. He picked up his radio and called the team. All personnel who interacted with the inspector are to report to the conference room for immediate review. This is mandatory. The voice crackled back with acknowledgement, but the usual energy was gone, replaced by a cold efficiency. Around the branch, employees who had earlier exchanged curious or dismissive looks toward Theron found themselves suddenly summoned or approached with formal notices. The receptionist who had ignored his appointment was handed a printed memo and instructed to pack up personal items and meet with HR. The janitor who sprayed disinfectant near his feet was quietly pulled from duty. Even junior bankers who had avoided eye contact now sat in small windowless rooms, facing supervisors who asked questions not about their work, but about their conduct, demeanor, and adherence to ethical standards. The staff who had laughed at Theron's expense or whispered about his presence were the first to realize the depth of the coming consequences. Outside, the early afternoon sun streamed in, indifferent to the turmoil inside. Theron himself remained calm, seated in the VIP lounge where the curtains still partially obscured his form. His briefcase lay closed at his feet, his hands folded neatly in his lap. He watched through the glass walls as figures in suits and badges began to fill the conference room adjacent to the teller stations. Their voices were low, serious, tinged with uncertainty and concern. This was the moment where silent observation became undeniable reckoning. The camera tracking system zoomed in on key individuals, replaying moments when discrimination had been caught on film. The man who had knocked Theron's papers from his hands, the woman who had smeared lipstick on his jacket, the guard who had treated him like a trespasser. Each clip was marked for further review, each timestamp logged and cross-referenced with transaction histories and employee schedules. The system was ruthless. It was meticulous, and it was impartial in its execution. Meanwhile, HR personnel arrived at desks to retrieve personnel files and note previous complaints, if any, against the implicated employees. The atmosphere in the branch shifted palpably, like a tide turning against long-standing norms of behavior that had gone unchecked. Whispered apologies and nervous glances replaced the earlier cold disregard. The power dynamic had flipped. Theron, still seated, felt none of the satisfaction that might accompany such a shift. He understood all too well that institutional change was slow and costly. That punishment alone did not repair damage done. But today, the first clear cracks had appeared in the facade of indifference. A mid-level manager approached the glass partition where Theron sat and silently nodded in recognition of his presence, eyes briefly holding a flicker of respect or perhaps regret. Theron nodded back, acknowledging that this silent exchange was the start of something larger. He wasn't just a victim anymore. He was an agent of accountability. The printers finally fell silent, the last sheets scattered across desks and tables. The monitors blinked in unison, signaling the end of the initial data sweep. Theron walked calmly through the bank's main hallway, the polished floor reflecting the stark fluorescent lights above like a cold river flowing beneath his feet. His steps were measured and deliberate, each one carrying the weight of the morning's ordeals, but also the quiet certainty of having set in motion a reckoning far beyond this single building. Behind him, the air remained thick with tension, yet his presence disturbed nothing. No one spoke, no voices rose in protest or defense. It was as if the entire institution had momentarily frozen, suspended in a hush that carried the unspoken realization that things would never be the same again. As he approached the cluster of offices near the executive suite, his gaze settled on a large digital display mounted on the wall, previously used to show performance metrics, sales targets, and monthly bonus updates for the bank's employees. The board's bright colors and celebratory numbers had once been a symbol of achievement and reward, a daily reminder of the corporate ladder's promises. But now, the screen was different. It flickered once, twice, then settled on a new message. Pending ethics evaluation, all bonuses frozen. The words glowed in bold, uncompromising letters against a dark backdrop. Around the board, portraits of smiling employees seemed to watch silently as the reality sank in. No cheers would come today. No congratulations. Instead, an entire branch's rewards had been withheld, not for financial mismanagement or missed quotas, but because of a deeper failure of character. Theron paused for a moment, letting the message settle in his mind like a stone dropped into still water. The silence was deafening. No one in the corridors looked his way. Staff moved past him, heads down, faces tight with suppressed anxiety. Some avoided eye contact. Others exchanged whispered conversations just out of his hearing range. There was no need for confrontation anymore. The institution had turned inward, confronting itself behind closed doors. This was a reckoning that no amount of denial could evade. Yet Theron's exit was not triumphant. There was no celebration, no raised fists or satisfied smirks. His victory was quieter, more profound. It was the slow and steady unfolding of justice that would ripple outward over time. It was the awareness that change began with acknowledgement and that accountability was the first step toward repair. As he reached the main entrance, Theron's thoughts drifted briefly to the countless others who had faced similar indignities, those who hadn't had the means, the credentials, or the resolve to demand recognition. His was a story now, a beacon shining through the shadows. But it was also a reminder of the many voices still unheard, the many battles yet to be fought. He stepped outside into the afternoon sun, the city bustling around him with indifferent rhythm. The streets carried the noise of life continuing as usual, unaware of the quiet revolution taking place within glass walls behind him. Theron looked up at the sky, the blue stretched wide and limitless. He took a deep breath, the cool air filling his lungs with a renewed sense of purpose. This chapter had closed, but the journey was far from over. Justice, he knew, was neither swift nor simple. It was a constant effort, a deliberate choice to stand firm in the face of injustice, to transform pain into progress, and to ensure that silence was never again a tool of oppression. Behind him, the digital board flickered once more before fading into a soft, steady glow. Its message lingered, not just a warning, but a promise, that no system was above scrutiny, no institution beyond reform, and that dignity demanded respect regardless of color, class, or circumstance. Theron walked away, leaving behind the echoes of footsteps, the quiet weight of consequence, and the unmistakable message that true change begins when those who suffer refuse to be invisible any longer. The end. A man walked into one of the city's most prestigious banks, dressed sharp, confident, carrying all the proof he needed that he belonged there. But from the moment he stepped inside, every door seemed to close a little tighter, every glance cut a little colder. He wasn't just ignored, he was systematically erased, subjected to a slow, invisible assault designed to break his spirit without a single word spoken aloud. What nobody realized was that beneath the quiet calm, behind that composed exterior, he held a power and a purpose that would turn the entire institution upside down. This is not just a story about discrimination. It's about a reckoning no one saw coming. If you want to follow the journey from silent humiliation to shattering truth, hit like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us where you're watching from, and let's uncover this story together.